Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. And today we are joined by a gentleman that we've had on this program several times before. His name is Calvin Trillin. His new book is called About Alice. It's published by Random House. But you know, Calvin, in all the times that we've had you on here before to talk about your books, I believe it's the first time that you're already an incredible bestseller. You're going to be number 4 on the New York Times list this coming Sunday, and you sit in the number 1 position in the San Francisco Chronicle, and they love you in Boston. They love you in Washington, D.C. What have you done to gain such fast-rising popularity for this book?
Well, it sort of worries me. I'm number 1 now in San Francisco, and I just arrived here for the tour. Maybe by the time I leave, I will have sunk like a stone.
I was thinking that when I saw it on Sunday. I said, my goodness, he hasn't been here yet.
That's right. Maybe that's my popularity.
You've done no evil yet.
That's right.
Well, I think it's because the book tells the story behind a dedication that you wrote for a book called Tepper Isn't Going Out. And that dedication was, I wrote this for Alice. Actually, I wrote everything for Alice. And I think in a way that's what this book is about, this story. What does that mean when you wrote that?
Yeah, well, that's partly what it's about. It's partly just a way of making an actual person out of Alice, who had a sort of sitcom role in some of the lighter pieces I did, as the sensible mother who kept things on an even keel despite the antics of her marginally goofy husband. And
only marginally.
Well, I have to say that it wasn't a portrayal that was totally opposite of what she was. She was definitely the most sensible grown-up in the house, but I thought that I should maybe let people know there was quite a bit more to her than that.
Yeah, well, one of the things she was, I mean, it was stated in the obit that she was your muse.
She was definitely my muse.
But that's not in the sense of telling you what to write.
No, she was the. Although sometimes she weighed in on that too. I mean, saying phrases like, well, that's the silliest idea I've ever heard of. Just things like that. But she was the first reader, and I think most importantly, she was the one I was trying to impress.
Mm-hmm. Well, this whole business about impressing her is something that you were trying to do right from the start when you first met her back in, 63 or so?
Yeah, I was... I met her and at a party and didn't get to talk to her very much for one reason or another. And then I conspired to be at another party about 10 days later where I thought she might be in attendance. And at that party, I compared it in the book to a lounge comic who hears that there's a booker from The Tonight Show in the audience. I used all my material. And,
the whole thing.
The whole thing. They used to say on The Tonight Show, well, yeah, he's got 5 minutes, but then if he's invited back, does he have another 5 minutes?
Right.
I use all of those 5 minutes. I mentioned that sometimes she'd say, 20 or 30 years later, you've never been funnier than you were that night. And I'd say, you mean I peaked in December of 1963? I'd say, I'm afraid so.
That really set a difficult course for you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I didn't quit trying.
Yeah, I mean, you just hung in there and you kept swinging.
It's just one of those baseball teams that thinks, well, next year it'll be it. We'll make the playoffs.
Oh, it's a political phrase these days, too. Stay the course.
Stay the course. I stayed the course.
Isn't that wonderful? One of the books mentioned in here that relates to your showing everything to her first, I think refers to the book about Denny, where she gave you a 4-page critique.
Yeah, that was unusual, but I wrote a book about a classmate of mine who was sort of the golden boy. Roger Dennis Hansen was his name. He was from San Carlos, not far from here.
Right.
And he was the person who we talked about being the president, and he was a Rhodes Scholar, and life covered his graduation. And he committed suicide in his 50s. And I left on a reporting assignment, and I left the rough draft with her, and she did write a memo, essentially saying that I was writing it too much as if I were a detached observer, and not as much enough as someone whose background was rather close to the subjects.
Right, and you were classmate also.
Yeah. So I sort of started over again.
Well, About Alice, thank goodness, reveals many things about her. Among them, how extraordinary Alice was in so many different ways. And we'll look at that when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com. About Alice is the book, Calvin Trillin is the guest, Random House is the publisher, and Publishers Weekly said some good things. You talk about Trillin, staff writer at the New Yorker since 1963. You were very young when you started there.
It was sort of like a, some people in high school work at the Burger King or something. I did the New Yorker.
You did the New Yorker as a teenager, It's often written about members of his family, notably his wife Alice, whom he married in 1965. Avoiding expressions of grief, Trillin unveils a straightforward, honest portrait of their marriage and family life. Focuses on her humor, her beauty, her child's sense of wonderment, what's the phrase you use, that if she saw a what in the forest?
A deer in the forest, she would say, wowzers.
What part of the country does wowzers come from? Do you know?
I never heard that before. I don't know. Certainly not Kansas City, I can tell you that.
No, it's not Kansas City. Her child's sense of wonderment, her relationship with her daughters, and her concern for others. This touching tribute is certain to stir emotions, and I know that it does. Let's talk about this. Your focus on Alice's beauty, and what's really nice about this book is that I think you give us two poems in which this beauty is memorably commented on by you. One is called A Conversation with Someone.
This is called A Conversation with Someone Who Can't Believe That Alice is 50. This is the first stanza of a poem I wrote for her when she was 50.
And if I recall correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this kind of family poetry, if you will, was the beginning of your poetry career.
Yeah, I used to be what I called a special occasion poet. Birthdays, weddings, that sort of thing. And before I became a deadline poet.
A deadline poet, yeah.
The first stanza of this poem goes, "No way, you say, it simply cannot be. I would have guessed that barmen often ask her for ID. I know, she has that youthful glow that still gives young men vapors. She's 50, though. I've seen her papers."
I love the rhyme of vapors and papers.
You don't see that often.
No. I looked for it. I Googled and I couldn't find it except there.
And this is a poem I wrote 11 years later when she was for her 61st birthday. "You josh, by gosh, or need some better specs. The lass I see must surely be from Generation X. Yes, still they stare, they're dazzled by her flair. The sight of her sends young men's hearts askew. So how come she remembers World War II?"
Well, not only that, but you tell us that there were a certain kind of guy that was really attracted to her.
Guys with pipes. Well, I called them guys smoking pipes who wanted to impress her with their suavity and their intellectual depth. And sometimes we'd be coming home from a party, and I'd say, mention some guy with a pipe, and she'd say, by the way, he wasn't smoking a pipe. And in fact, I don't think any of those people you call guys with pipes were smoking pipes. So, yeah, I thought I saw him tapping it out or whatever they do. Tamping it. Yeah. I mean, you must be a pipe smoker, Jim. Yeah, there are a lot of people, and then occasionally we'd meet somebody who really was instantly hostile to her. There's a chapter in this book about the complications of being pretty.
Yes.
Which is something that I really hadn't thought of. I didn't have any reason to think of it, but to tell you the truth, but until I met Alice.
Oh, you're too modest.
Someone just sent me a magazine, dated, I don't know, 1956 or something like that. That was called The Girls of the Ivy League, not in a Playboy way. This was called Ivy Magazine, and they went and they looked for the 2 or 3 prettiest girls of Wellesley, where Alice was, and it was she and Ally McGraw were in the magazine. Those were and
Alice and Ally.
Yeah, and then one other woman who became an actress too. I think her name was Barbara Babcock.
Yeah. This is a very political time in our country, and besides being a raving beauty, Alice had some really big ideas on the big issues. For example, she had a notion called the Alice tax.
Yeah, she believed that after a certain income, and she was willing to negotiate the income, and even negotiate an income that allowed for a rather large boat, if necessary. She thought that after a certain income, the government should simply take everything.
What a great idea!
And she was she had a sense of enoughness.
I must warn you all, About Alice is addictive. The more you read, the more you want to know. The more you know about her, the more you love her. And we'll have, therefore, a bit more about Alice when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast. The book today is about Alice, and the guest is Calvin Trillin. And this book was reviewed a few weeks ago in the New York Times Book Review by a gentleman by the name of Peter Stevenson. And before I read an excerpt from it, I just want to say Stevenson gets it right. He talks about this. To read a first-person narrative too often involves being clamped in an embrace by a writer who means well, but insists on meaning too much, the banality of ego. And yet, sometimes we come across a piece of first-person writing that shocks us back into a restorative innocence vis-a-vis the human heart. The secret of Calvin Trillin's slim but walloping book about Alice is that its structure follows the contours of an old-fashioned piece of reportage, using a scrim of detachment to build tension and, when that is pulled aside, revealing an underlying core of enchantment. About Alice is an unabashed love letter to Trillin's wife, Alice, blah, 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 blah. And I think that's an incredibly important statement, given what we've gone through with first-person writing in the last couple of years. I mean, congratulations.
Thank you. Well, I think that one thing that happened with memoir is that there was sort of an atrocity arms race, that you had to reveal some hideous secret.
Yeah.
That if your childhood didn't include at least incest or your grandmother sniffing glue or maybe a touch of bestiality or something, you were in bad shape. I think that's a sort of a period that may have ended by now.
I hope so. I hope so. And I think that this notion that the thing that he describes is really true in here. There is a scrim of detachment. that you have, and then all of a sudden, pow. And of course, the pow comes most often when you're talking about the cancer.
Right.
And one of the things that Alice said was the worst thing cancer can do is rob you of your identity. And I don't think she ever allowed that to happen.
No, I think she when people say people are battling cancer or fighting cancer, I think part of the fight, because there's certain things about it that are out of your control.
Sure.
And but I think what's in your control is to try to keep that or any other disease like that from turning you into somebody you're not, and to turning you into a different person.
Yeah, and she says you should stay the who you are.
Yes, and she always did that. She was an optimist, and she was an activist. I mean, she wanted to go to wherever she thought people knew the most about it. I mean, and she treated it as a sort of an intellectual puzzle, the way she treated other things. So she didn't want to be in what she called in a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, the land of the sick people. She wanted to be who she was.
At the very end, Abigail gets married.
Right.
And by God, she gets there. By God, she walks down the aisle with you and Abigail. And then she sends out an email about the affair. Yeah,
it was an email to the group of people I'd been keeping informed of her condition. We had sort of a group email.
Yeah.
And most of the first paragraph was in caps. It said, Abigail got married yesterday and I was there. I was there for the whole thing. Got to say my toast, quite moving, and eat chocolate cake and watch Bud's 87-year-old Uncle Jerry, who married Sarah and Alex in Malibu last June, dance his ass off with Alice Waters, who had brought me roses from her garden in Berkeley.
Do you have film of that?
You know what? I don't think there was any film. And my uncle, who's still around, he's in his 90s now, but he was a retired librarian, really, which I think you should be able to marry people anyway, because they're very good at keeping people quiet. But he actually became a deputy commissioner of civil marriage in California, which you can do one day in your life. I told him, he was then about 88 or something, and I said, are you sure you want to shoot your wad on this one? Because you can only do it once. And he was close to Sarah, so he said it was okay. Yeah.
Speaking of Sarah, Sarah shortly thereafter has to say some words at the memorial service.
Yeah, Alice and Sarah had talked a lot about Sarah. Alice sometimes said talking to Sarah made her feel like she was talking to the too cool cheerleader. And at the memorial, Sarah said, I know my mom's main goal in life was to protect my sisters, my father, and me. She wanted to protect us from worry, from sadness, from loneliness, things her parents had not been able to protect her from. She ended by saying, Mom, I know you're listening somewhere, waiting patiently to hear me say these words. You were the coolest girl I ever knew.
She is the coolest girl you ever knew. The book is about Alice. The author is Calvin Trillin. If you don't buy this book, you're crazy. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's inspiring. And this has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.